Cal Drayton leaned back in his cockpit, scanning the vast emptiness of space. His fighter, the Vanguard, was on a routine patrol along the outer rim of human-controlled territory. Out here, nothing but silence and distant stars filled the void. It was supposed to be an uneventful flight, a simple sweep before returning to the carrier. But then, his ship's emergency alert system blared to life. A distress signal pulsed through his comms, weak and fragmented. Cale frowned, tapping a few controls to boost the transmission. The message was in Galactic Standard, but the accent was strange, almost alien. "Anyone, please, we are under attack. This is Commander Vanev Sol of the Auxiliary Fleet. Our ship is..." The voice crackled, cutting off into static. Cal's breath caught. The Auxiliary, a race of highly advanced beings who rarely, if ever, interacted with humans. They kept to themselves, never seeking alliances or trade. If one of their ships was sending an SOS, it meant things were bad. His training told him to report the signal and wait for orders. But every second wasted could mean lives lost. Gritting his teeth, Cale adjusted his course, locking onto the coordinates of the distress beacon. His engines roared to life as he punched forward into the unknown. Minutes later, Cale dropped out of hyperspeed, and his stomach twisted. Before him floated a massive Auxiliary starship, its sleek, silver hull scared and burning. Deep cracks ran along its structure, and lifeless debris drifted around it. This wasn't just an accident. This was an attack. His ship's scanners flickered. No enemy ships detected, but energy signatures suggested they had left only recently. Whoever did this could return at any moment. "Vanguard to Auxiliary vessel," Cale transmitted. "Commander Vena, do you copy?" For a long moment, only static replied. Then, "Human." The voice was weak, filled with exhaustion and suspicion. "Yes, my name is Cal Drayton. I received your distress signal." A pause. Then, "Our engines are failing. Life support is critical. We need help." Cale exhaled sharply. He had no idea how many survivors were aboard, but if their life support was failing, they didn't have much time. "I'm coming aboard," he said firmly. "No," Vena's voice snapped back, suddenly stronger. "You're human. Why would you risk yourself for us?" Cale smirked despite the situation. "Because that's what humans do." Without waiting for a reply, he activated his docking procedures. As his fighter latched onto the auxiliary ship's external airlock, he grabbed his survival kit and prepared for whatever waited inside. The door hissed open. The air smelled of burnt metal and ozone from failing circuits. Emergency lights flickered, casting eerie shadows along the sleek, curved walls. He stepped forward, scanning the hallway. The ship was barely holding together. Then, he heard it. Footsteps. Cale turned, and there she was. Commander Vena Sol, tall and regal, her deep violet eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Her silver-white hair, streaked with dust and ash, framed her sharp features. She wore a damaged Auxiliary exosuit, its once pristine armor scorched from battle. Her gaze hardened as she raised a sleek alien weapon at him. "Human," she said coldly. "You shouldn't be here." Cale raised his hand slowly, but his eyes never left hers. "And yet, here I am." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, the ship trembled violently. A deep, warning hum echoed through the corridors. Cale glanced at the flickering emergency displays. His stomach dropped. Another enemy ship was inbound. A deep rumble shook the auxiliary vessel, sending sparks raining from overhead panels. Cale barely had time to brace himself before the floor lurched beneath his feet. The warning alarms blared louder, a clear sign that the ship's systems were failing fast. Vena Sol, still holding her sleek alien weapon, steadied herself against the wall. Her sharp violet eyes darted toward the flickering display panel behind Cale. Enemy contact confirmed. Cale cursed under his breath. Whoever had attacked the auxiliary ship was coming back to finish the job. "We need to get out of here now," he said firmly. Vena's expression hardened. "There is no escape. Our engines are crippled. Life support is barely functioning. You should leave while you still can." Cale smirked. "Not really my style." Before she could argue, the ship trembled again. A distant explosion rocked the lower decks. Cale glanced at his wrist scanner. The structural integrity of the auxiliary ship was rapidly declining. If they didn't act fast, they wouldn't have a ship left to save. Vena seemed to come to the same conclusion. She lowered her weapon and took a breath, as if forcing herself to trust him. "Follow me," she said, turning sharply and moving deeper into the corridor. Cale followed, his eyes scanning the wreckage. He had never seen the inside of an auxiliary ship before. Their technology was sleek and elegant, vastly different from the bulky, industrial designs of human vessels. But now it was in ruins. Flickering lights, exposed wiring, and collapsed corridors painted a grim picture. "We were ambushed," Vena explained as they hurried toward what looked like a command center. "We were on a diplomatic mission when they struck without warning." Cale frowned. "Who?" She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "The Zarkari Dominion." Cale's hands clenched into fists. He knew that name well. The Zarkari were a ruthless, war-hungry race that had been causing trouble along the outer systems. But attacking an auxiliary ship, that was bold and dangerous. "They must have been tracking us," Vena continued, her voice tight with frustration. "We fought back, but we were outnumbered. We managed to drive them away, temporarily." She turned to face him. "They will return in force." As if on cue, Cale's comm system crackled. A robotic voice filtered through. "Unidentified human vessel. Disengage immediately." "This is Dominion territory." Cale's heart pounded. The Zarkari had already spotted his ship. Vena looked at him. "Your fighter is too small to be a threat, but if they realize you helped us, they'll blast me out of the sky," Cale finished. "Yeah, I figured." For a brief moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. The Zarkari weren't just coming to scavenge. They were coming to destroy. Vena took a breath, her violet eyes locking onto his. "There may be another way." Cale raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." She gestured to a damaged control panel in the command center. "If we can reroute power to the emergency thrusters, we might be able to move the ship, just enough to escape into a nearby asteroid field." Cale glanced at the flickering monitors, showing just how damaged the vessel was. "That's a lot of ifs." "It is our only chance," she said, determination flashing across her face. Cale grinned. "Well, I do like impossible odds." Together, they rushed toward the control panel. Time was running out. Cale gritted his teeth as he worked on the control panel, his fingers moving fast across the unfamiliar auxiliary interface. Sparks shot from a broken circuit, and the screen flickered dangerously. The emergency thrusters were in terrible shape, and there was no guarantee this plan would work. Vena Xal stood beside him, her hands hovering over the controls, guiding him where she could. Even though she was a commander, she had never expected to be trapped on a dying ship, relying on a human to pull them out of this mess. "We're running out of time," she said, her voice sharp. "The Zarkari warships will be here in minutes." Cale exhaled sharply. "Yeah, I got that." He yanked open a panel, revealing the ship's main power conduits. The wiring was severely damaged, and in some places, it had completely melted. "This ship is a mess. We need a miracle to get these thrusters online." Vena's jaw tightened. "Then find one." Cale let out a short laugh, half amused, half frustrated. He had been in tight spots before, but this was next-level insanity. Still, he didn't back down from a fight. He quickly scanned the damaged circuits. A power reroute might be possible, but it would overload the ship's last functioning systems. That meant losing internal defenses, comms, and artificial gravity. Not ideal, but if they didn't escape, none of that would matter. All right, here's the deal, Kale said, looking up at Vena. I can reroute power to the thrusters, but it'll shut down almost everything else. Once we're moving, we'll have no shields, no communications, just us and whatever's left of your engines. Vena's eyes narrowed. Do it. Kale smirked. I like your style, Commander. With a deep breath, he grabbed a handful of exposed cables and began reconnecting them, forcing energy away from secondary systems. The ship groaned as it struggled to process the sudden changes. Lights flickered wildly, and a low hum vibrated through the floor. Then, the worst happened. The main screen blared a warning. The Zarkari ships had arrived. They're locking weapons, Vena warned. Kale cursed. Just a little more time. The ship shuddered violently as the first Zarkari blast struck. A section of the hull exploded outward, sending debris into the void. The ship was falling apart. Now, Kal, Vena shouted. Kale grabbed a metal lever and yanked it down with all his strength. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a deep rumble filled the ship. Outside, the damaged thrusters suddenly roared to life, spewing out blue flames. The ship lurched forward, its engines sputtering and shaking, but it was moving. The asteroid field was only a few kilometers away. If they could reach it, they'd have cover. But the Zarkari weren't about to let them escape so easily. They're pursuing, Vena said, gripping the edge of the console. Their ships are faster. Kale grinned. Then we make them regret chasing us. He spun the controls, shifting the ship's trajectory into the densest part of the asteroid field. Massive chunks of rock drifted ahead, each one big enough to flatten a battleship. The first Zarkari fighter swerved to avoid an incoming asteroid. Too late. The rock slammed into its hull, sending it spiraling into oblivion. Vena's lips curled slightly. Impressive. Kale laughed. Stick with me, Commander. I've got plenty more tricks. But just as the ship dodged another asteroid, the warning lights flashed red. One of the Zarkari warships had locked on, charging its main cannon. Vena's face darkened. Brace for impact. Kal's grip tightened on the controls. This was going to be close. Kal's heartbeat hammered as the Zarkari warship's main cannon glowed with deadly energy. He gripped the controls of the damaged auxiliary vessel, feeling the ship shudder beneath him. The asteroid field was thick, but that wouldn't matter if the Zarkari landed a direct hit. Vena saw, her violet eyes locked onto the threat, moved swiftly to the tactical station. Her fingers danced over the holographic controls, but with most of the ship's systems rerouted to the thrusters, there wasn't much she could do. We have no shields, she said through clenched teeth. One shot from that cannon, and we're finished. Kal's eyes narrowed as an idea sparked in his mind. He glanced at the debris floating ahead, wreckage from their earlier battle. His pilot instincts kicked in. Not if I make them miss, he said with a cocky grin. Without waiting, he pushed the ship hard to the left, skimming the edge of a massive asteroid. The warship's cannon fired, and a blinding energy blast streaked toward them. Kale spun the ship, letting the gravity of the asteroid pull them downward. The shot missed by meters, instead colliding with a drifting wreck. The explosion rippled outward, sending burning debris in every direction. Vena's eyes widened slightly in admiration. That was reckless. Kale smirked. That was genius. The Zarkari warship adjusted course, still locked onto them. Fighters swarmed like predators sensing blood. Kale pushed the engines to their limits, weaving between asteroids, using every chunk of space rock as a shield. But they were still outgunned. Another shockwave rocked the ship. A nearby fighter had grazed them with its laser cannons. Kal's grip tightened. The ship couldn't take much more. Then, Vena's console flashed. A distress signal, she muttered, her gaze snapping toward the readout. Someone is nearby. Kal's expression hardened. Friend or enemy? Vena hesitated. Unknown. The warship charged another shot. Kale didn't have time to think. He had to make a choice, risk calling for help from an unknown source, or face the Zarkari fleet alone. He made his decision. "Send the signal," he said. "Whoever's out there, we need all the help we can get." Vena didn't argue. Her fingers moved swiftly, broadcasting their location with a priority distress call. Seconds stretched into eternity. The Zarkari closed in. The warship's cannon reached full charge. And then, a new energy signature appeared on the radar. Vena's breath caught. Something's coming. Kale squinted at the screen. A ship was approaching fast, but its energy signature wasn't Zarkari. It was human. And it was big. With a sudden burst of light, a massive human battlecruiser dropped out of hyperspace. It bore the markings of the Terran Defense Fleet, and its guns were already firing. The lead Zarkari warship barely had time to react before the first volleys of plasma fire tore into its hull. The fighters scattered, their attack formation breaking apart in chaos. Kale grinned. "Now that's what I call timing." Vena's gaze lingered on the Terran ship. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something almost impressed in her eyes. The battle wasn't over yet, but now they had a fighting chance. Kel's pulse raced as the massive Terran battlecruiser unleashed hell upon the Zarkari fleet. Plasma turrets spat fire, cutting through enemy fighters like a hot blade through ice. The Zarkari warship, once poised to destroy them, was now scrambling to defend itself. Vena's fingers moved across the damaged tactical console, analyzing the incoming fleet. "That ship, it's the TDF Revenant," she murmured, recognition flashing in her eyes. "It's one of your top warships." Kale smirked. "Damn right it is." He activated the comms, hoping the battlecruiser was listening. "Revenant, this is Cal Corin, flying a borrowed Silari vessel. Any chance you can give us a little breathing room?" A crisp, commanding voice crackled through the speakers. "Kale, you reckless bastard. You've got a hell of a habit of being in the worst possible places." Kale grinned despite himself. He recognized that voice. Commander Doran Wraith, one of the finest captains in the fleet. "You know me, Doran. I like to keep things interesting." Doran's chuckle was short-lived. "Your ship is barely holding together. Get behind us. We'll clean up this mess." Kale didn't need to be told twice. He angled the Silari vessel hard, skimming dangerously close to a drifting asteroid before diving beneath the Revenant's massive shadow. The sheer size of the battlecruiser was awe-inspiring, its dark hull glowing with the light of its weapons. The Zarkari fleet hesitated. Kale could almost hear their confusion. The Zarkari weren't used to being outmatched. But Doran wasn't about to give them a chance to regroup. "Fire at will," he ordered. The Revenant's forward cannons ignited, launching a barrage of hyper-accelerated plasma rounds straight into the Zarkari warship's hull. The enemy ship shuddered under the impact, its shields cracking like glass. Then the Terran battlecruiser fired its railgun. A brilliant streak of light cut through space, slamming into the Zarkari warship's weakened defenses. The enemy's hull erupted in a chain reaction of explosions, sending flaming debris spiraling into the void. Kale let out a whistle. "That's gonna leave a mark." But the battle wasn't over yet. Two remaining Zarkari destroyers turned to flee, their engines burning bright as they accelerated away from the battlefield. Kale narrowed his eyes. He knew the Zarkari. They weren't cowards. They had a plan. "They're not running," he muttered. "They're regrouping." Vena's gaze hardened. "They'll be back, with reinforcements." Turan's voice came through the comms again. "Kale, you and your new friend better get aboard. That ship of yours won't last another fight." Kale glanced at Vena. The Exilari commander stood tall, her violet eyes unreadable. She had fought beside him, trusted him, even when she had no reason to. And now, a decision loomed between them. The Revenant's hangar doors opened, an invitation to safety. But something in Vena's expression told Cal she wasn't ready to abandon her people just yet. "They're coming back with more ships," she said. "We need to be ready." Kale exhaled. rubbing his temple. And by we, I assume you mean me too. Vena's lips curved into the slightest smirk. You saved my ship. The fight isn't over. Kale let out a short laugh. He had a feeling this was only the beginning. With a quick turn, he steered the battered Silari vessel toward the Revenant's hangar. One battle had been won, but war was still on the horizon. The hangar of the TDF Revenant was a flurry of motion as Cal set the battered Silari ship down with a less than graceful landing. Sparks spat from the ship's ruptured hull, and warning lights flickered like dying stars. He exhaled and leaned back in his seat. Well, that could have been worse. Vena, still strapped into the co-pilot's seat, glanced at him with a raised brow. You consider this a success? Kale smirked. We're still breathing, aren't we? The moment the landing gear locked in place, the hangar crew swarmed the ship, securing it and extinguishing a small engine fire. The heavy blast doors sealed behind them, locking out the cold abyss of space. As Kale and Vena stepped down from the smoking vessel, Commander Doran Wraith strode toward them, his piercing green eyes fixed on Kale. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with an air of authority that could silence a battlefield. His uniform was crisp, his stance rigid. This was a man who didn't waste time on pleasantries. Kale, Doran said, folding his arms, I should have you locked in a cell for all the regulations you've ignored. Kale grinned. Good to see you too, Commander. Doran's eyes flickered toward Vena. There was no hostility, but there was caution. And I assume this is the Silari commander. Vena stood tall, meeting his gaze without a hint of intimidation. Vena Xal, she said smoothly, you have my thanks for intervening. Doran studied her for a moment before giving a short nod. We received your distress signal and picked up your transmission about the Zarkari forces regrouping. If you're right, we've only bought ourselves a short window before they return. Vena's expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of urgency in her eyes. They will return. The Zarkari do not take humiliation lightly. Kale leaned against a nearby crate, which means we need to hit them first. Doran's gaze snapped to him. You can't be serious. We're outnumbered. Kale shrugged. Since when has that ever stopped us? Doran sighed, rubbing his temple. Kale, this is not some reckless dogfight. This is war. The Zarkari will come back with reinforcements, and we don't have the numbers to take them on alone. Vena stepped forward. Then don't fight alone. Both men turned to her. I have forces, she continued. Not many, but enough to strike first if we move quickly. If we coordinate with your fleet, we can cripple the Zarkari before they fully regroup. Doran frowned. You want the Terran Defense Fleet to work with Silari forces. Do you have any idea what you're asking? Kale chuckled. Sounds like she's asking for the same thing we need. Chance to win. Silence hung between them. Then, with a heavy breath, Doran turned to one of his officers. Get me a tactical assessment. I want every available ship prepped for engagement. He looked back at Vena. We fight together, but make no mistake. If your forces turn on us, I'll personally see to it that your people regret it. Vena's violet eyes didn't waver. I would expect nothing less. Kale clapped his hands together. Well, look at that. A beautiful alliance. Doran gave him a flat stare. You're still on probation. Kale smirked. Wouldn't have it any other way. As the preparations began, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something bigger. And soon, the real war would begin. The war room aboard the TDF Revenant was filled with a tense energy. Holographic projections flickered above the central table, displaying the incoming Zarkari fleet, a massive force, larger than anticipated. Red markers represented enemy ships, and there were far too many of them. The Terran-Silari alliance was outnumbered 3-1. Kale leaned forward, hands on the table, studying the projections. This is bad, he muttered. Vena, standing beside him, remained calm. It's worse than bad. She pointed at the Lid Zarkari battleship, a hulking behemoth bristling with weapons. That ship alone could wipe out half our fleet. Doran exhaled sharply, his gaze hard. Then we take it out first. The room fell silent for a moment. Then Cale grinned, his usual reckless spark lighting up his eyes. A direct attack is suicide. But what if we make them think we're doing exactly that? Doran folded his arms. Explain. Cale tapped the projection, highlighting a dense asteroid field nearby. We use this for cover. Hide the main fleet, send a small force. Me, obviously, to bait them into a trap. Vena studied the plan, her mind already calculating. You'd be the perfect target. They've seen what you can do. If you act alone, they'll chase you. Doran frowned. And when they do? Cale smirked. We hit them hard. From all sides. The plan was reckless. It was dangerous. But it was the best shot they had. The battle began with Cal's fighter cutting through space like a streak of lightning. He weaved between the Zarkari warships, his engines burning bright as he drew their attention. Come on, you ugly lizards, he muttered, dodging a barrage of plasma fire. Chase me. And they did. Zarkari fighters broke formation, speeding after him like a pack of hungry beasts. Even the massive battleship began turning, its cannons adjusting to track him. Cale pushed his ship to its limits, dodging, rolling, and leading them straight into the asteroid field. Cal, you better not get yourself killed. Vena's voice crackled over the comms. You'd miss me too much, he shot back, pulling a sharp turn between two asteroids. Get ready. As the Zarkari fleet followed him into the asteroid field, the trap was sprung. From the shadows, the combined Terran and Silari forces burst into action. Warships emerged from hiding, unleashing a coordinated onslaught of torpedoes and laser fire. The Zarkari, caught in the tight quarters of the asteroid belt, struggled to maneuver. Vena led her Silari strike force with precise, deadly efficiency. Her ships weaved through the chaos, targeting weak points in the enemy's armor. Meanwhile, Doran's capital ships focused fire on the massive Zarkari battleship, hammering its shields with relentless firepower. Cale, still in the thick of the fight, threaded the needle between debris, taking out fighters that got too close. His targeting system locked onto the Zarkari flagship's bridge. This is for all the pilots you've burned, he growled. He fired. The explosion rocked the enemy battleship, flames bursting from its side. Its shields collapsed. The Alliance fleet seized the moment, delivering a devastating final blow. The Zarkari forces crumbled, their formation shattered. Those that survived began retreating into deep space. The battle was won. As the smoke cleared, Cal exhaled, his heart still racing. Well, that was fun. Vena's voice came through the comms, soft but firm. It's not over yet. She was right. The Zarkari had been defeated today, but they would be back. And next time, they wouldn't make the same mistake. Cale looked out at the wreckage, gripping the controls tighter. The real war was just beginning. The battlefield was quiet now, but only in the way a storm settles before the damage is measured. The wreckage of Zarkari warships drifted through space like shattered bones, their flames slowly dying in the void. The combined Terran and Silari fleet floated nearby, victorious but bruised. Cal's fighter docked aboard the TDF Revenant, his hands still tight on the controls. His ship had taken damage, burned plating, warning lights flashing on his dashboard, but he was alive. That was enough for now. As he stepped onto the deck, Doran was already there, arms crossed. You took one hell of a risk. Cale smirked. Worked, didn't it? Doran exhaled sharply but nodded. Barely. His gaze softened just a little. Good work, Cal. Before Cal could make a cocky remark, the intercom crackled. All commanders, report to the war room immediately. That meant Vena was back. The war room felt heavier than before. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Holographic projections flickered above the table, showing intelligence gathered from the wreckage. Vena stood at the head of the table, her violet eyes hard and unreadable. We need to move. Now. Doran frowned. We just won this fight. Why rush? Vena tapped the screen. The image zoomed in, revealing a Zarkari distress signal pulsing from a distant sector. The Zarkari didn't expect to lose here, she explained. This message means they're calling for reinforcements. Kale leaned forward, his fingers drumming on the table. How many? Vena met his gaze. Enough to wipe us out. A silence fell over the room. The fleet was in no condition to fight again so soon. Damaged ships needed repairs, wounded soldiers needed treatment, and supplies were running low. Doran clenched his jaw. We can't hold another battle like this. Kale ran a hand through his hair. Then we don't fight here. All eyes turned to him. We lure them somewhere else, he explained. Somewhere we control. Vena's lips pressed together, considering a strategic retreat. Kale nodded. Exactly. If they're calling for reinforcements, we make them think we're running scared. They'll chase us, but we pick the battleground. Doran sighed. This is starting to sound familiar. Vena folded her arms. And where do you suggest? Kale grinned. Ever heard of Drexus 9? The TDF Revenant and the rest of the fleet moved quickly, warping away before the second Zarkari wave could arrive. Their destination, Drexus 9, a barren, storm-ravaged planet with deadly magnetic storms and treacherous terrain. It was the perfect trap. As the fleet arrived, engineers and soldiers worked tirelessly to prepare the battlefield. Mines were placed in orbit, stealth barriers were activated, and fighter squadrons hid within the storm clouds. The goal was simple: make the Zarkari believe they had the advantage until it was too late. Vena watched from the command deck, arms behind her back. This plan is reckless, she admitted. Kale grinned. That's why it'll work. Doran exhaled. Or get us all killed. Kale patted his shoulder. That's the spirit. As they waited for the enemy's arrival, a final transmission came through. It was heavily encrypted, but one message was clear. The Zarkari Supreme Fleet was on its way. This was it. The final stand. The moment had arrived. The Zarkari Supreme Fleet dropped out of hyperspace, a wave of colossal warships emerging against the backdrop of Drexus 9's swirling storms. Their blackened hulls bristled with energy weapons, and their fighters swarmed like a deadly cloud. The enemy was confident. They thought they had trapped a fleeing force. But in reality, they were the ones walking into a trap. Kale stood in the cockpit of his fighter, helmet on, hands gripping the controls. His squadron floated just beyond the storm's edge, their ships hidden within Drexus 9's chaotic magnetic interference. All they needed to do was wait for the signal. On the TDF Revenant, Vena watched from the command deck, her eyes locked on the incoming enemy fleet. Doran stood beside her, fingers hovering over the command controls. They have no idea, Doran murmured. Vena gave a small, determined nod. Let's keep it that way. The Zarkari flagship sent out a broadcast. A deep, guttural voice filled the comms. Humans, surrender. There is no escape. You have lost. Kale smirked inside his cockpit. That's cute. Vena responded calmly, her voice laced with confidence. You're right about one thing, Zarkari. There is no escape. Then she gave the command. All units, engage. The trap snapped shut in an instant. Hidden orbital mines detonated in perfect sequence, shredding the Zarkari vanguard. Their forward ships exploded in brilliant bursts of fire, caught completely off guard. From the planet's surface, Turan rail cannons emerged from beneath the sandstorms, firing massive slugs into the enemy's flanks. The magnetic interference messed with their targeting systems, throwing their fleet into disarray. Then, from the storm clouds, Kale and his squadron struck like lightning. Stay tight. Hit their cruisers first. Kale's ship barrel rolled through incoming fire, dodging plasma bolts as he weaved between enemy fighters. His squadron blasted through the confused Zarkari formations, turning their sleek warships into burning wreckage. A massive Zarkari dreadnought turned its cannons toward the Terran fleet, but before it could fire, a stealth destroyer decloaked behind it and unleashed a full payload of torpedoes. The ship's hull shattered, sending debris spinning into space. The battlefield became chaos. The Zarkari tried to regroup, but every time they moved, they were met with another deadly surprise. More mines, more hidden turrets, more ambushes. Kale looped around a burning cruiser, his targeting system locking onto the enemy flagship. "Vena, I've got a clear shot at their command vessel." Vena's voice came through. "Take it." Cal's hands were steady as he armed his ship's experimental railgun. He only had one shot. The Zarkari flagship loomed in front of him, its shields flickering under the relentless attacks. Firing. The railgun roared. A lance of energy shot across space, punching straight through the Zarkari flagship's core. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the ship erupted in a chain of explosions. Fire and debris ripped through the enemy fleet, sending them into full retreat. Their supreme leader was dead, their forces shattered. The battle was over. On the TDF Revenant, cheers erupted. Soldiers hugged, pilots whooped over comms, and engineers slumped in relief. The war was won. Kale docked his ship and stepped onto the deck, pulling off his helmet. Vena was waiting for him. "You always have to do things the reckless way, don't you?" she said with a smirk. Kale grinned. "It worked, didn't it?" Doran clapped him on the back. "Let's hope we don't have to do that again." Vena looked out at the stars, where the last remains of the Zarkari fleet flood into the void. "If they come back," she said, "they'll remember what happened here." Kale crossed his arms. "Yeah, and they'll know. Humanity doesn't run. We fight." As the fleet turned toward home, the universe itself seemed to take notice. The Zarkari Empire had fallen, and humanity had cemented its place among the stars. The end.